Alright everybody, it's time for us to continue the Destiny 2 subclass tier list video series. We finished tiering all of the Warlock subclass branches, and last week we added the Striker Titan to the list. If you missed any of those videos, especially the first one, you can check the link in the top right now. We went over the criteria I'm using to tier the subclass branches, and also talked about a bunch of interesting stuff, which is exactly what we're going to do today as we add the Sentinel Titan to our tier list. Let's get started. The Sentinel Titan is without question the most diverse of the Titan subclasses, but before we start tiering each branch, let's make note of the universal mechanics. Like with all Titans, you have access to 2 class abilities, Rally Barricade and Towering Barricade, 3 lift types, Strafe Lift, Catapult Lift, and High Lift, and 3 grenades, the Suppression Grenade, Magnetic Grenade, and Void Wall. With those universal mechanics in mind, let's get specific. We're going to start things off with the bottom branch of the Sentinel, the Code of the Aggressor. Its melee ability is Shield Bash. After sprinting for a short time, you hit your melee button to charge forward and bash a single target and deal area damage around the point of impact. You disorient enemies and suppress the target you hit with your Shield Bash. Next up, the passive ability Superior Arsenal. Grenade kills reduce the cooldown of your grenade by about 25% per kill. In the Trenches is another passive ability. Kills while surrounded by enemies reduce the cooldown of your super. Finally, the Second Shield is a passive ability that affects your super. You gain an additional shield throw charge while your super is active. As the branch's name suggests, the Code of the Aggressor gains tremendous benefits from adopting an aggressive playstyle. The harder you push into enemy lines and surround yourself with combatants, the more bonus super energy you'll gain with the In the Trenches passive, and the sooner you'll be able to whip out this branch's most powerful asset, its super. At a base level, the Sentinel Shield super is respectable, but it gets taken to new heights with the Second Shield passive and the subclass-specific exotic, the Doomfang Pauldrons. Their exotic perk causes void melee kills to grant bonus super energy, and while Sentinel Shield is active, shield throw hits increase the duration of your super, and melee kills from your light attack reset your shield throw. The Doomfang Pauldrons and Second Shield combine together to make your super last for longer than any other super in the game, while also allowing you to access that super state faster than any other subclass in the game, provided you can leverage your positioning and abilities correctly. It's that same combination that turns an otherwise middle-of-the-road super into a top-tier one. Now here's where things start to get interesting. Every ability in the Code of the Aggressor is fantastic, but like what happened with the Code of the Juggernaut, Destiny 2's system mechanics make it difficult to execute the branch's intended playstyle and realize its full potential, especially at higher difficulties. Fighting in the literal trenches to trigger the In the Trenches passive ability is a death sentence, and there's nothing I can do as a player to change that. No matter how high my resilience is, no matter what combination of minor spec, concussive dampener, and elemental resistances I have, enemies will always rip me to shreds in content like the Nightfall Ordeal, and even dungeons if I don't engage with Destiny 2's combat like a traditional sci-fi military shooter. With that in mind, the Code of the Aggressor does a decent job of skirting along the edge of feeling in place and out of place in Destiny 2's sandbox. Unlike the Code of the Juggernaut, I don't actually have to brawl with enemies to use my CQC abilities effectively. I can choose my battles, carefully picking off large groups with a shield bash and grenade, then falling back to cover where I'm meant to be. This feels like a bit of a lame concession, but at least I have the option of making it. In fact, options are what makes this subclass branch so strong. In addition to dealing respectable damage, Shield Bash suppresses and disorients enemies, which disables their abilities and renders them unable to fight back. This can be great against wizards, ogres, and other targets that are a pain in the ass to deal with if they're left to do whatever they want. You can take your flexibility even further by using the Suppression Grenade, which has a similar effect to your Shield Bash, with a bigger radius and the safety of range. If you're really good with your throws, you can score a few kills to trigger Superior Arsenal's cooldown reduction, while suppressing majors and mini-bosses that are too strong to be killed by a single grenade. And since I just mentioned Superior Arsenal, it's a great ability, but you have to be good with your grenade throws in order to get the most out of it, so practice makes perfect. Overall, I wanted to give the Code of the Aggressor an S tier because that's where it belongs. Shield Bash is versatile, its damage is nice, but it also applies crowd control. Superior Arsenal scales well with player skill and positioning. A well-placed grenade can have its cooldown reduced by more than half or completely reset. and in the trenches gives players access to their super more than any other subclass in the game. And then your super is going to last longer than any other super in the game if you have the Doomfang Pauldrons equipped. This is an amazing package. But I can't give it an S tier because the Code of the Aggressor and the concepts within are connected to Destiny, and the game won't let it be as good as it should be. The Code of the Aggressor falls short of greatness and lands in A tier. Next up, it's time to talk about the Sentinel's top branch, the Code of the Protector. Its melee ability is Defensive Strike. On kill, you create an overshield around you and nearby allies. Final blows while the overshield is active reduce the cooldown of your melee ability. Turn the Tide is a passive ability. Your overshield from Defensive Strike gets its duration increased, and while the overshield is active, your melee damage and reload speed are also increased. Rallying Force is another passive ability. Melee kills restore health for you and nearby allies. Finally, we have a super augment, Ward of Dawn. In addition to being able to use the Sentinel Shield super in its normal form, you can hold down the activation button to create a dome shield to protect you and your allies. Passing through the Ward of Dawn grants you a buff called Weapons of Light that significantly increases your weapon damage. While inside the ward, you also have a very durable overshield. The overall kit for the Code of the Protector doesn't have a well-defined gameplay loop, but its melee ability does. You're supposed to run in and punch someone to death so you get an overshield, and while that overshield is active, you try to kill as many enemies as possible to reduce the cooldown of your melee ability so you can start over and do it all again. Besides that, once you read through the rest of the skills, it's very clear that the Code of the Protector wants you to stay up close and personal with your enemies. Similar to the bottom branch of the Striker, the Code of the Protector excels in close quarters combat, but because of that fact, it suffers from the same set of problems. Namely, Destiny 2's lack of defensive options make it difficult to survive at ranges where you're supposed to thrive. The Code of the Protector attempts to make up for Destiny 2's lack of defensive options in your mods and armor by baking that defense into your abilities. Defensive Strike is great in concept. You punch an enemy to death with this ability and then you get an overshield, but the overshield it provides feels like toilet paper once you leave public events. In other words, it needs a serious buff. Now, Destiny 2 is a game that has PvE combat and PvP combat, and the game's developers are regrettably unwilling or unable to balance the two sides of the game completely separately, and those decisions or limitations have huge negative effects on both sides. It's painfully obvious that things are left tame or even toned down to keep the player versus player sides of the game from feeling too much like a wacky carnival game and more like a first-person shooter that takes itself seriously. Whether it succeeds in achieving that feel is questionable, but at the end of the day, both sides are always hurt in the attempt. In the case of the Code of the Protector, Defensive Strike is a great ability that doesn't perform well enough in high-end content, so it loses a lot of points. To make things even worse, the weakness of the overshield provided by Defensive Strike unfortunately has a negative effect on the Turn the Tide passive, since it only applies while the shield is active. So TLDR, if your overshield doesn't last more than a few seconds, you don't get to actually turn the tide of battle for very long. So now we've got 2 out of this subclass's 4 abilities being great concepts but not being balanced well. That leaves 2 abilities, a passive and a super, to do a lot of heavy lifting. Rallying Force is a better version of the Striker's reversal ability. It applies health regeneration to you and healing to your allies. Since it applies health regeneration instead of a fixed amount of healing, it won't give you the same survivability as Devour because health regeneration gets interrupted when you take damage, but it's still nice to have. Lastly, Ward of Dawn is the glue that holds this balancing nightmare together in PvE. The Weapons of Light buff it provides is the strongest weapon damage buff you can apply in the game. The buff has a fantastic duration of 15 seconds, but with the ward itself lasting for 30 seconds, you can have Weapons of Light active for 45 seconds. To make things even better, the Helm of Saint 14 Exotic lets you carry a portion of the overshield strength you get while inside the ward outside. But here comes the problems again. Your shield while inside the Ward of Dawn is nearly impenetrable. The overshield provided by the Helm of Saint 14 Exotic is roughly the same strength as the overshield from Defensive Strike, which means it's not very strong. With all of that stuff in mind, I'm actually very annoyed. Once again, a Titan subclass manages to have a fantastic concept and overall design, but it's hindered by the fact that it exists within Destiny 2, a game that isn't entirely sure what it wants to be. Or maybe it does know what it wants to be, but these subclass branches haven't been reformed to meet with that identity. Everything in the Protector's kit works, but it doesn't work everywhere. The tactics you employ in public events and strikes will be fun, rambunctious, and effective, but when you step into the Nightfall ordeal or a dungeon, you'll feel the chinks in your armor very acutely. Ward of Dawn provides the definitive best weapon damage buff in the game, and the best defenses in the game, but you can't have them both at the same time, at least not really. If you're standing inside the Ward of Dawn, you can't shoot enemies that are outside of it, and if you're standing outside of the Ward of Dawn, you don't have impenetrable defenses. So, ultimately, the Code of the Protector is going to fall into B tier, and it fell really hard because this subclass was supposed to be great. Last up, we're going to add the middle branch of the Sentinel, the Code of the Commander, to our tier list. Its first ability is the passive Controlled Demolition. Whenever you hit a target with a Void ability, you attach a Void detonator to the target. Further hits on the target will cause the detonator to explode, dealing damage to surrounding enemies. You can also kill the target to cause the explosion. Resupply is another passive ability. You and nearby allies receive melee and grenade cooldown reduction and health when you destroy a Void detonator. Your melee ability is Tactical Strike. On hit, you cause a Void explosion that applies Controlled Demolition to all enemies it hits. Finally, Banner Shield is a super augment for Sentinel Shield. Guarding with Sentinel Shield creates a large defensive wall. Allies who stand behind it have their weapon damage increased, and the shield provides protection from attacks from the front. Additionally, guarding while you have allies behind you makes the shield last longer. The Code of the Commander is the prime example of what works in Destiny 2. It has phenomenal base abilities that can each be snowballed out of control with creative use of exotic armor, weapons, and mods, and it doesn't feel like the game needs to be overhauled for the Code of the Commander to be good. Controlled Demolition is a fantastic passive ability, one of the best in the game. Not only is it enhancing the base level functionality of your grenades and melee, but the way it's designed interacts with enemies of every strength level in all difficulty levels. You can destroy them by dealing additional damage to the target or just straight up kill it. That means it works on minors, majors, and bosses. This is also going to improve the value of Resupply. Resupply is the version of Rallying Force on the Code of the Protector that your girlfriend tells you not to worry about. In addition to providing health in a fixed amount instead of through health regeneration, so it can't be interrupted, it provides cooldown reduction to your melee and grenade for you and your entire fire team. This effect is so powerful that it makes difficult content easier when you use it well, and that is a hugely important fact. A well-placed grenade can apply its detonators to multiple targets to give everyone in your fire team a trickle of CDR and health regen as you fight your way through encounters, and this effect can be triggered from the safety of range from grenade throws, but it also has value when applied aggressively with a punch too. Speaking of melee abilities, Tactical Strike does the same base damage as your normal melee strikes, but the fact that it applies Void detonators to the target hit and all nearby enemies in a respectable radius makes it absurdly strong. Running into a crowd of enemies will always be dangerous, but if you've got the means to quickly kill a single enemy that you apply detonators to, the rest of them will fall within seconds from the chain of detonations you'll trigger. The last and most interesting part of the Code of the Commander is its super. It functions the same as the normal Sentinel Shield super, although it does deal increased damage because it applies Void detonators on hit, but the larger shield that you get when you guard allows for a lot more versatility. In lower difficulty environments, you won't need to use your guard often, but at the highest level, it has great potential to snowball your team. Guarding against enemy attacks generates a lot of orbs of light, which can be picked up by your team to fuel their super. So if you can focus all the enemy fire towards a single direction, you can keep them safe, buff their weapon damage, and generate enough orbs for a more powerful, longer-lasting super, like an Arcstrider with Raiden Flux. If you don't know what that is, don't worry, we'll get to it eventually. The Banner Shield super even has an exotic that was designed specifically for it. While all branches of the Sentinel can make use of the Ursa Furiosa exotic gloves, the benefits to the Code of the Commander are a lot more obvious. Its exotic perk allows you to move faster while guarding, and guarded damage converts to super energy when your super ends, which means you'll be able to get your next one significantly faster if you take enough hits. In the Nightfall ordeal, enemies do not play games, so if done correctly, you can have Banner Shield active for most of the Nightfall. Overall, the Code of the Commander is a perfect subclass branch for the way Destiny 2 is designed. It's insanely fun to blow stuff up with controlled demolition, but the effectiveness and synergy with assets that exist in the game make it even better. The same is true for Resupply. The Tactical Strike melee ability isn't impressive on its own, but I think that's how it's supposed to be. It's a means to apply void detonators to targets, and those detonators trigger resupply when they explode. Finally, the Banner Shield Super is incredibly versatile. At the low end, you don't need that versatility, so you can shield bash your way through encounters, but at the highest level, having the ability to protect your team, buff their damage, and generate orbs for their supers is invaluable. The Code of the Commander is the Titan's first S-tier subclass. And there we go, the Sentinel Titan has been added to the tier list, and it's looking pretty good. Unfortunately, the limitations of Destiny 2's system mechanics are hitting the Titan pretty hard. The fact that players can't spec themselves into a more defensive playstyle has hurt the Code of the Juggernaut on the Striker, and it's caused severe problems for the Code of the Protector and the Code of the Aggressor. But thankfully, they have very strong abilities that make them usable and viable in a lot of situations, despite not being at the tippy top of the tier list. If Destiny 2 ever gets improvements to the mods that increase player defenses, then the Code of the Protector and the Code of the Aggressor are going to feel a lot stronger to play, because they'll be able to fight in the ranges that they're designed to fight in without having to stress. With all of that said, we are going to wrap things up here, but don't worry, we've still got more tier list action to get through. We're going to finish off the Titan with the Sunbreaker, and then we're going to move on to the Hunter, so stay tuned for a vote so we can decide which Hunter subclass branch we're going to do first. As always, if you enjoyed this video and you'd like to support the channel more than you already do just by watching, liking, subscribing, and commenting, you can head over to patreon.com/iBluairJgR to become a patron. As always, the name of the game is Destiny 2, the name of the channel is iBluairJgR. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.